When the world's most nuclear-armed state crumbled, the world was forced to walk a geopolitical tightrope, and the wrong move could literally result in the end of the world. In today's episode of the Infographics Show, we'll look at what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union is a Russian story, but one of the key players was America's president, George H.W. Bush. Under President Reagan, the United States had embraced a far more confrontational tone against the Soviet Union, with a buildup of U.S. military forces that set Soviet military planners scrambling. Any doubt about American military capabilities were put to rest as the U.S. unveiled the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, capable of dropping a nuclear warhead directly on the Kremlin while avoiding Russian air defenses. Careful diplomacy had tightened an economic noose around the Soviets, who were suffering both at home and abroad from their failing invasion of Afghanistan. Upon taking office, Bush immediately ordered a review of strategic policy toward the Soviet Union, pursuing a more reconciliatory tone. This shift in American policy would be critical for the future of the Soviet Union and spurred on by reforms initiated under Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev saw the writing on the wall, and he initiated a policy of glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring, meant to relieve Soviet society from overbearing state control. He also sought out ways to reform the Soviet economy, and to do that, he needed American help, a deeply unpopular move with hardline communists. But a simple slip of the tongue on November 9, 1989, would cause the Soviet Union to collapse. For 2 years, pressure in East Berlin had been building for the removal of the Berlin Wall and travel restrictions. The Soviets had resisted all calls to remove the restrictions, and as tensions mounted, a press conference was held. Looking to assuage the protesters, government spokesman Günther Schabowski addressed a crowd of international reporters in a scheduled press conference. Prior to going on stage, though, he had been given new notes directly from the Kremlin, but he had no time to read them before starting the conference. The Kremlin had sought to soothe tensions by announcing a lifting of travel restrictions, but with major caveats that would make an application process extremely long and effectively prevent anyone from actually leaving East Germany. Schabowski, however, had only read part of one of the new speaking points given to him and announced to a crowd of stunned reporters that travel restrictions were being lifted. A reporter asked when the policy would go into effect, and a flustered Schabowski stated that as far as he knew, it was immediate. The televised press conference spurred a surge to the border that Soviet guards were unable to stop, beginning the collapse of the Soviet Union, though few knew it at the time. The snowball began to pick up momentum. After the loosening of restrictions by Gorbachev, democratic movements sprung up across Eastern Europe. President Bush implored Gorbachev not to use violence, knowing that the Soviet Union crushed anti-communist movements within its military in East Germany in 1953, in Hungary in 1956, and Czechoslovakia in 1968. To the world's surprise, though, Gorbachev did not send military troops and allowed pro-independence movements to spring up unchallenged. Power struggles within the Soviet Union were already fully underway. Opening up elections for a brand new parliament, the Congress of People's Deputies signaled the first democratic election in Russia since the Russian Revolution of 1917. Gorbachev expected to earn major support through the election of nominees, but instead the Russian people were drawn to far more radical pro-democratic candidates, such as Boris Yeltsin. This significantly undermined the Communist Party's power and would plant the seeds of one of the most traumatic events in the fall of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's reforms were encouraged by President Bush, who supported the establishment of a multi-party system and a presidency. Bush hoped that it would weaken the communist hardliners and swing the Soviet Union toward a more democratic state. Despite pressure from the CIA and other agencies, Bush opted to do nothing about the growing independence movements across Soviet states that had been annexed or occupied in the wake of World War II. Instead, Bush thought it was best to preserve his relationship with Gorbachev. This would lead to the signing of the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty in 1990 and begin final negotiations for the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START. These would be major political wins that would become a bedrock of European security. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty was aimed at preventing either side from launching a surprise attack against the other. It limited the number of tanks, combat vehicles, heavy artillery, and combat aircraft that the Soviet bloc or NATO could have deployed between the Atlantic Ocean and the Ural Mountains. This significantly favored NATO, which had a disadvantage against the massive forces of the Soviet bloc. Superior NATO equipment would give Western armies an advantage, but the true capabilities of modern Western militaries wouldn't be on full display until the invasion of Iraq in 1991. Gorbachev, however, was secretly relieved to sign the treaty, as the Soviet bloc's military was a drain on the Soviet economy at a time when the Union was floundering economically. However, the hardliners in the Kremlin were furious, as the cuts in equipment disproportionately affected the Soviet side of the equation. They were also angry that Gorbachev hadn't negotiated a reduction in naval assets as well, an area that NATO overmatched the Soviets in. Tensions were coming to a boil following elections in May 1990. The Communist Party had secured 920 of the 1,068 seats, but many within it were supporters of a democratic Russia. Boris Yeltsin would be elected chairman of the Supreme Soviet and advocate for more democratic reforms. Meanwhile, communist power brokers opposed any such moves and were becoming increasingly angry with Gorbachev's leadership. From their point of view, Gorbachev was allowing the Soviet Union to slip away, and they were right. Yeltsin had quickly become a major political power, and President Bush found himself split between supporting Gorbachev or Yeltsin. However, Gorbachev was viewed as more politically stable, and it was his numerous concessions to the US that prompted Bush to throw most of his support behind him. Gorbachev agreed to remove Soviet troops from East Germany and even agreed to German reunification. Among the many Soviet military and government officials hurrying to vacate offices and destroying classified documents would be a young Vladimir Putin, who would remember well the humiliation he felt at what many communists saw as Gorbachev's great betrayal. Things in the Soviet Union became increasingly more destabilized as former Soviet client states first declared autonomy, then independence. Soon Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, as well as the Caucasus, began to demand complete independence. Gorbachev's attempts to reform the Soviet Union so as to avoid an outright revolution had emboldened nationalists who began to take to the streets in mass protests. Reformers gained many key political positions amongst the Baltic states, and legislation such as re-establishing native language as national languages instead of Russian was passed in all three countries between 1988 and 1989. The most destabilizing moves came in 1990, when the Lithuanian Supreme Soviet declared Lithuania independent of the Soviet Union. Estonia followed suit just weeks later on March 30th, but because of a significant presence by Soviet troops, declared the Soviet Union to be an occupying power and issued a timetable for transition to independence. Latvia followed suit a month later on May 4th. The Baltics were some of the Soviet Union's most strategic client states, and the issue of their independence could reshape the world order. The Soviet Union declared all declarations of independence as illegal, as the three countries had not undergone the process of secession outlined by the Soviet Constitution of 1977. Because the Baltics had been originally independent and occupied by Soviet troops, though, they argued that the Constitution did not apply to them as occupied powers, and that they had a right to independence pursuant to international law. At first, the Soviet Union attempted to economically blockade the breakaway powers, but the declaration of sovereignty by the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the largest Soviet republic and the one that makes up Russia today, complicated any attempt to stop the process of independence. The Baltic states immediately began to negotiate directly with the Russian Federal Republic, undermining the government's attempts to deal with the situation. This would result in Gorbachev sending in military troops to quell the independence movement, with 20 civilians killed and hundreds injured by live fire. President Bush immediately condemned the violence and began to reconsider how best to deal with what was now obviously a crumbling Soviet Union. The Bush administration came up with three options. President Bush could continue supporting Gorbachev and prop him up so as to avoid a full collapse of the Soviet Union, important because chief amongst American concerns would be the ultimate fate of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. It was also feared that a violent collapse could prompt military conflict across Eastern Europe, creating a refugee crisis and prompting NATO to enter the fight in order to avoid Soviet nuclear and conventional weapon stockpiles from ending up in the wrong hands. There was also the chance that communist radicals could end up launching a nuclear weapon against the West, blaming it for the collapse of the Soviet Union. The second option was to prepare for an inevitable breakup of the Union and shift support away from Gorbachev and toward Boris Yeltsin, who was increasingly popular amongst the Russian people. The White House would also extend support to the various republics that were already independent, or that were undergoing independence movements. The hope was that the US could guide the Soviet Union through a relatively peaceful breakup with minimal political or military fallout. The final option was to pressure Gorbachev into enacting even further political and economic reforms to attempt to reshape the Soviet Union and create some political stability. This would be accomplished by offering financial aid, as well as continuing the industrial and economic assistance already being provided under a previous agreement in a bid to reshape the Soviet economy with American capitalist know-how. Chief on Bush's list of concerns was the vast number of Soviet nuclear weapons, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and artillery still in service. Enacting arms control measures were critical to stability in Europe and to prevent a catastrophic all-out war during an increasingly dangerous time. So President Bush opted for a mix of options B and C, hoping to avert a violent collapse of the Soviet Union while preparing for a peaceful transition to a post-Soviet reality. As President Bush showed his support for Gorbachev by signing the START Treaty at the Moscow Summit in 1991, diplomats acting on his orders were already in contact with Yeltsin. The Bush White House knew it was straddling a knife's edge, and it opted to play both sides as an insurance policy. The Baltics remained a point of contention between Bush and Gorbachev, but that problem would resolve itself with the first outward sign of full Soviet collapse. While Soviet secret police and intelligence operatives attempted to undermine the Baltic independence movements, Russia declared itself sovereign on June 12, 1990. It enacted new laws, many of which contradicted Soviet laws, and emboldened the rest of the Soviet republics. Gorbachev attempted to prevent a full-on dissolution by calling for a union-wide referendum, where over 77% of residents of the various Soviet republics, except for the Baltic states, Armenia, Georgia, and Moldova, who boycotted the vote, all voted in favor of maintaining the Union. Ukraine would abstain from negotiations over a new treaty which would bind together the Soviet republics into a union of Soviet sovereign republics that would be autonomous but bound together by a single president, a common foreign policy, and a unified military. Before the new Union Treaty could be signed, however, Communist Party hardliners launched a coup in August of 1991. Angry at the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the loss of control over various Soviet client states and republics who were now newly independent, the hardliners saw Gorbachev as responsible for weakening the Union and leading it to a full collapse. The new Union Treaty would be the final death knell for the Soviet Union, and they acted before it could be signed. KGB agents were dispatched to arrest Gorbachev at his home, where he was held under armed guard. However, Boris Yeltsin avoided capture by the KGB and quickly led a march on the Kremlin against the coup planners. The coup had been hastily organized, and the plotters were not prepared for the massive crowd of protesters who followed Yeltsin's march on the Kremlin, and they were forced to admit defeat. The coup attempt would forever diminish Gorbachev and make Yeltsin the most politically powerful man in the now officially crumbling Soviet Union. President Bush would condemn the coup and shift his full focus on supporting Yeltsin as Gorbachev resigned as the head of the Communist Party. The Central Committee would be dissolved by Russian President Yeltsin, and Ukraine and Belarus, smelling an opportunity, declared themselves fully independent. The Baltic states, now emboldened by the collapsing Soviet Union, pressed the UN for international recognition of their independence. The US responded by stating the 5 principles that would guide American policy toward the newly independent Soviet republics. 1. It would recognize self-determination in alignment with democratic principles. 2. Recognition of pre-existing borders. 3. Fully support establishment of democratic institutions and the rule of law. 4. The preservation of human rights and the rights of ethnic and national minorities. And 5. Respect for international law and obligations. These publicly stated principles set out a blueprint for the newly independent republics. If they wanted American assistance and recognition, they had to follow these 5 guidelines. President Bush would also dispatch Secretary of State James Baker to Russia to speak with both Gorbachev and Yeltsin in an effort to smooth an economic and political transition for the new Russia and their former republics. The priority now became about ensuring a stable transition to a post-Soviet Eastern Europe, and of paramount concern was accountability for the vast Soviet nuclear and conventional weapon arsenal, now split up across a variety of different newly independent nations, many of them still politically unstable and rife with corruption and organized crime. After nearly half a century of being sworn enemies, American engineers, economists, and security professionals were now invited into Russia and the former Soviet territories to help guide economic and political transitions. American financial aid went directly to help upkeep and maintain the Russian nuclear arsenal, after some U.S. inspectors discovered the catastrophic state of nuclear security at some Russian sites after the collapse of the Soviet Union. At one facility, only a single padlock on a chain-link fence separated any would-be thief from a small stash of nuclear weapons. Massive amounts of American funding went directly into decommissioning Soviet weapons of mass destruction, and the U.S. was instrumental in negotiations to return nuclear weapons and nuclear delivery aircraft back to Russia from various Soviet republics, notably in Ukraine. The Nunn-Lugar Act in the U.S. would establish the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program in November 1991, immediately funding the dismantling of former Soviet nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. With the economic situation in the new Russian Federation dire, President Bush would be instrumental in helping President Yeltsin to secure badly needed aid from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Various programs to help avoid a full-blown humanitarian crisis in Russia were established, with funding coming in from Western Europe and even special programs that sent off Russian children to live with Western European families during the summer so as to relieve financial pressure on the Russian people. Somehow, a global nightmare had been prevented. Now go check out what happened immediately after 9/11, or click this other video instead.